George Harrison. He was the quiet Beatle, the spiritual seeker whose music reached for the divine. He was a musical genius who finally stepped out from the massive shadow of Lennon and McCartney to create what many call the finest solo album by any Beatle. That masterpiece, All Things Must Pass, was a monumental three-record statement of artistic freedom and spiritual devotion. And at its heart was a song that became a global anthem, a hymn for the entire world. But this isn't a story about a flawless icon. It's about how that very same song, a prayer set to music, dragged its creator through a decade of legal hell. It's the story of how a man celebrated for his sincerity was branded a fraud by a court of law. George Harrison, a spiritual icon, and the genius behind one of the most beloved songs of all time. But what if his greatest hit was built on a lie? This is the story of how a single lawsuit branded a rock star a fraud and established a legal precedent that still haunts songwriters to this day. To get the story of My Sweet Lord, you have to get George Harrison. By 1969, the Beatles, the biggest cultural force the world had ever seen, were collapsing. For George, the band's lead guitarist, the end wasn't just a tragedy, it was a liberation. For years, he'd been stuck in the shadow of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting machine. While he'd penned classics like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Here Comes the Sun, his creative output was famously rationed. He got maybe 2 or 3 songs per album, leaving him with a huge backlog of material. He later described the feeling as being creatively constipated. The breakup of the Beatles was the laxative he needed. In 1970, the floodgates burst open. Harrison went into the studio to record All Things Must Pass, a sprawling, ambitious triple album that became his definitive artistic statement. It was a declaration that he wasn't just the quiet one, but a visionary in his own right. The album was soaked in the spirituality that now defined his life, a journey into Indian music and philosophy that had become his creative core. The centerpiece of this epic album came to him in a moment of pure serendipity. In December 1969, Harrison was on tour in Europe with the American duo Delaney and Bonnie, alongside his friend, keyboard wizard Billy Preston. During a press conference in Copenhagen, Harrison ducked out to an upstairs room with a guitar. He started vamping chords, looking for a melody. He began with simple words of praise, Hallelujah. Then he wove in the Sanskrit mantra at the heart of his faith, Hare Krishna. His goal was deeply personal, to write a pop song that was also a gospel hymn, a call to God that could unite Western and Eastern faiths. He wanted to show that Hallelujah and Hare Krishna were really the same thing. He later said his main musical inspiration was the Edwin Hawkins singer's 1969 gospel hit, Oh Happy Day, and you can hear its influence in the song's ecstatic call and response energy. Harrison was so excited by the idea that he immediately shared it with the other musicians. Initially, Harrison didn't even keep the song for himself. He first offered it to Billy Preston, who recorded it for his 1970 album on Apple Records. But when it came time to pick the lead single for his own massive album, the choice was obvious. With its soaring slide guitar and Phil Spector's lush production, Harrison's version of My Sweet Lord was undeniable. Released in November 1970, the song was a colossal success. It shot to #1 all over the world, becoming the first solo single by an ex-Beatle to top the charts in the US and UK. It was more than a hit. It was a phenomenon. John Lennon even joked, "Every time I put the radio on, it's Oh My Lord. I'm beginning to think there must be a God." For Harrison, it was the ultimate validation. He'd finally stepped out of the shadows and written a universal prayer that touched millions. But as the song saturated the airwaves, someone else was listening. And they didn't hear a divine message. They heard theft. The song that would come back to haunt George Harrison was a ghost from 1963. It was called He's So Fine, a doo-wop pop hit by a girl group from the Bronx called the Chiffons. He's so Fine was a classic of its time, an infectious track that went to #1 on the Billboard charts in the U.S. and was a top 20 hit in the UK. The song was written by a young man named Ronald Mack. Tragically, Mack died from Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1963, shortly after his song became a smash hit. The rights to his song eventually ended up with a publishing company called Bright Tunes Music Corporation. For years, He's So Fine was just a beloved oldie. But in late 1970, the folks at Bright Tunes started hearing My Sweet Lord everywhere, and they heard an echo. In fact, they heard their song. To them, the melody and structure seemed to be a direct lift from Ronald Mack's composition. On February 10, 1971, while Harrison's spiritual anthem was still dominating the charts, Bright Tunes Music filed a copyright infringement lawsuit. The accusation was simple and devastating. George Harrison, the spiritual Beatle, was a plagiarist. At first, Harrison's team blew it off as a nuisance lawsuit. But as friends and colleagues started pointing out the resemblance, Harrison himself couldn't ignore it. In his autobiography, he later wrote, "I wasn't consciously aware of the similarity, although when my version of the song came out, people started talking about it, and it was then I thought, why didn't I realize? It would have been very easy to change a note here or there and not affect the feeling of the record." Recognizing this could get messy, Harrison's team tried to settle. They offered Bright Tunes a pretty significant deal, 40% of the song's U.S. royalties, which was about $150,000 at the time. But Bright Tunes, possibly egged on by a shadowy figure from Harrison's past, refused. They didn't want a piece of the pie. They wanted the whole thing. The negotiations collapsed, and the case was set for trial. The stage was now set for a legal drama that would not only question Harrison's integrity, but force the courts to ask a bizarre question. Can you steal something you don't even know you're taking? After years of legal squabbling, George Harrison walked into a New York federal courtroom in February 1976. The case of Bright Tunes Music Corp. v. Harrison's Music, Limited, was officially in session. The scene was a spectacle, a former Beatle on trial for being a musical thief. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. They argued that the melodic structure of My Sweet Lord was practically identical to He's So Fine. They brought in musicologists and giant charts to break it down. As Harrison recalled, they had huge charts made up with the 3 notes from Motif A and the 4 or 5 notes from Motif B. They talked about these for about 3 days, to the point where I started to believe that maybe they did own those notes. Let's break down their argument. They identified 2 key musical phrases, or motifs. Motive A is the opening phrase in He's So Fine, sung to the words He's So Fine. That same pattern appears in My Sweet Lord with the words My Sweet Lord. Motive B is the response phrase, the do-lang, do-lang, do-lang part. In My Sweet Lord, that exact pattern is used for the Hallelujah chants. The prosecution's point was that while neither phrase was complex on its own, the sequence, motive, a repeated followed by motive B repeated, was a unique musical signature. Harrison's song used the exact same pattern. The smoking gun was a subtle grace note, a tiny ornamental flourish that appeared in the second repetition of motive B in both songs. Copying a melody is one thing, but copying such a small, quirky detail? That seemed like copying a mistake, making it highly unlikely to be a coincidence. Harrison's defense wasn't to deny the similarity. He couldn't. His entire case rested on his intent, or lack thereof. He maintained his inspiration was the gospel song Oh Happy Day, and any resemblance to He's So Fine was an accident. This led to the trial's most dramatic moment, George Harrison on the witness stand. He was visibly uncomfortable, having to defend his deeply personal creative process under a legal microscope. He brought a guitar with him and tried to show how he composed, how chords and melodies flowed together. He was earnest, sincere, and utterly convinced he hadn't deliberately stolen anything. This is where the case pivoted to a groundbreaking legal question. If Harrison didn't mean to copy it, but the songs were still identical, what was that? This gave birth to the legal concept at the heart of the case: subconscious plagiarism. The theory was that Harrison, who admitted he'd heard "He's So Fine" on the radio in the 60s, had absorbed the melody without realizing it. Years later, when he needed a tune, his brain served it up, and he thought it was his own. Paul McCartney famously had a similar scare with "Yesterday," spending weeks playing it for people to make sure he hadn't accidentally lifted it from somewhere. So, the court was stuck. On one hand, you had a beloved and seemingly honest artist swearing he didn't steal a thing. On the other, you had two songs that were, in the court's words, virtually identical. The fate of My Sweet Lord rested with one man, you, as District Judge Richard Owen. Critically, Judge Owen wasn't just a lawyer, he was also knowledgeable about music, a fact that gave his final ruling incredible weight. On September 7, 1976, he delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the music industry. He started by addressing Harrison's intent. In a moment of personal vindication, Judge Owen stated, "Did Harrison deliberately use the music of He's So Fine? I do not believe he did so deliberately. He bought Harrison's story, but then the hammer fell." Judge Owen continued, "Nevertheless, it is clear that My Sweet Lord is the very same song as He's So Fine with different words. This is, under the law, infringement of copyright, and is no less so even though subconsciously accomplished." It was a landmark decision. George Harrison was found guilty of plagiarism. The court had officially recognized the concept of subconscious plagiarism. It didn't matter if you meant to steal. If you had access to the original work and your new work was substantially similar, you were liable. For Harrison, it was a devastating blow. The song that represented his liberation had become the source of his greatest humiliation. But the ordeal was far from over. The verdict was just the beginning. Now, they had to decide on the damages. How much was a stolen, subconscious thought worth? This next phase would drag on for years, getting even messier and more personal, thanks to the return of one of the most controversial figures in Beatles history, their former manager, Alan Klein. With the guilty verdict in, the case entered a new, grim phase. The penalty. The initial damages were set at a massive $1.6 million, representing a huge chunk of the song's earnings. This financial fight was about to be hijacked by a truly nasty twist. Enter Alan Klein. Klein was a notoriously aggressive businessman who had briefly managed the Beatles. His tenure was divisive, to say the least, and by 1973, Harrison and the others had cut ties with him. Klein had been on Harrison's side when the lawsuit was first filed in 1971, but after being fired, he saw an opportunity to profit from his former client's misery. While the damages were being sorted out, the plaintiff, Bright Tunes Music, was having its own financial problems. In a stunning act of betrayal, Alan Klein, through his own company, ABKCO, swooped in and bought Bright Tunes in 1978 for $587,000. Think about that. George Harrison's former manager, a man who had been privy to his legal strategy, had just bought the company that was suing him. Alan Klein was now the plaintiff. He had switched sides to go after the very artist he was once supposed to protect. The court was appalled. The judge recognized that Klein had used confidential information gained while working for Harrison to inform his purchase of Bright Tunes. The case devolved from a debate about art into a bitter feud over money and ethics. It was a miserable, draining experience that left Harrison deeply cynical about the music business. The joy of My Sweet Lord had been totally poisoned by years of litigation and treachery. The convoluted legal battle finally staggered toward a conclusion in the early 1980s, though some minor details dragged on, making it one of the most prolonged legal fights in music history. The final court ruling was a stunning reversal of fortune. The judge, furious with Klein's unethical conduct, ruled that Klein should not be allowed to profit from his breach of duty to Harrison. Ultimately, George Harrison was ordered to pay Klein's company, ABKCO, the sum of $587,000, the exact amount Klein had paid for Bright Tunes. In exchange, Harrison was effectively granted ownership of the song he was accused of copying. After a decade of hell, George Harrison ironically ended up owning the rights to both My Sweet Lord and He's So Fine. It was a legal victory, but the emotional cost was immense. The lawsuit had shattered his confidence. He became paranoid about writing, once saying, "I don't even want to touch the guitar or piano in case I'm touching somebody's note." He admitted he was afraid to write new music, terrified that another ghost from the radio was hiding in his subconscious. But Harrison, ever witty, channeled his frustration into his art. In 1976, he released a song pointedly titled This Song. The track is a jaunty, satirical take on his courtroom nightmare, with lyrics like, "This song has nothing tricky about it. This song ain't black or white, and as far as I know, don't infringe on anyone's copyright." It was his definitive statement on the whole absurd affair. Despite the ordeal, Harrison never regretted writing My Sweet Lord. He wrote in his autobiography, "I don't feel bad or guilty about it. It saved many a heroin addict's life. I know the motive behind writing the song in the first place far exceeds the legal hassle." The case of Bright Tunes versus Harrison's became a landmark in copyright law. It established the principle of subconscious plagiarism, a legal gray area that adds a layer of anxiety to the mysterious act of creation. Ed Sheeran's recent victory in a similar copyright case shows just how relevant the precedent set by Harrison's ordeal remains. In the end, George Harrison was exonerated in spirit but condemned by a legal technicality. He was a musician who wanted to write a universal prayer and was instead dragged through a decade-long battle over a handful of notes. The ordeal revealed the ugly side of the music business and the profound betrayal he suffered at the hands of Alan Klein. But it also showed his resilience and his unwavering belief in his music's power. So, what do you think? Was the verdict a just application of copyright law, or was it a punishment for a crime Harrison didn't even know he committed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories about the music you love.